topic of Indigenous peoples' sovereignty can be challenging for people unaware of the political status of the first inhabitants of the United States, let alone Indigenous peoples in other settler colonial nations. It is especially worth pointing out that sovereignty, as the term comes to us in English from the Western tradition, is neither the term nor the concept used by most Native peoples. What Native peoples demand is the right to self-determination and the right to govern their own lands. This gets conflated with sovereignty, but is not quite the same thing. And so while Shakespeare's The Tempest is not primarily a play about the early stages of British imperialism, no one can hear Caliban's impassioned complaint about his dispossession from his home and not think of all those Indigenous persons who felt similar outrage at losing sovereignty over their homelands and themselves. "This island's mine, by Sycorax my mother, which thou takest from me." That line rings in the ears of Indigenous people around the world, particularly the world of the former British Empire, upon which the sun was said never to set. Contemporary productions have relocated the play's setting from an unknown island in the Mediterranean to Haida Gwaii on the Pacific coast of Canada, the Caribbean, Huron-Wendat in Quebec, Mohegan Territory in Connecticut, and the Torres Straits Islands of Australia, all of which speaks to how the play resonates among colonized and/or formerly enslaved peoples. But that does not mean Indigenous sovereignty is always the focus of reinterpretations. Both Aimé Césaire and George Lamming reworked the play from a Black Caribbean perspective that focused on Caliban's enslaved and subaltern status. But for Indigenous peoples, it's more the loss of control over our own lands and freedom than it is about forced labor. And that brings us to the issue of land. Prospero presumes to have peremptory rights over the island because of his belief in his own superiority, both in learning and actual power. The island is not the ancient homeland of Caliban. His mother was banished there, but he knows it as his birthplace and has an intimate knowledge of his environment. He also deeply regrets having shared that knowledge with Prospero. "I showed thee all the qualities of this isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren places and fertile. Cursed be I that did so." Indigenous sovereignty is inexorably associated with land. Our societies flourish when we recognize that our relationship to the land is as much determined by responsibilities as it is by rights. We maintain our collective right to protect the land and all that's on it, and we do so with our custodial duties toward the environment in mind. Many Indigenous people see Caliban as a figure with intimate knowledge of his homeland. "I'll show thee every fertile inch of the isle," who has been dispossessed of it by an outsider who takes that knowledge freely offered and then labels Caliban monstrous. The Tempest is often listed as a romance, but from Caliban's perspective, it's a tragedy. For a large portion of the early modern period, the term sovereign was most often applied to the preeminent leader or ruler of a realm. It often referred to a king or a prince. When European explorers first encountered the indigenous peoples of the Americas, following Columbus's 1492 landfall, they often projected on native societies leadership systems based on their own experiences in Europe. That meant sachems and sansquas, or headmen and headwomen of native societies, were frequently labeled kings or queens or princes. Paramount leaders might likewise be called emperors or empresses. But in general, Europeans recognized that native societies were organized as polities with layers of territorial leadership and social organization. Such a recognition of political organization had its limits given the goals of European imperialism. In absence of large urban centers in most of North America, there was a presumption that indigenous polities were a primitive version of European aristocratic realms. By the 1590s in England, Native American nations were being described as tribes rather than nations, which placed them below nations in the political hierarchy of the day. If a tribe was a polity among so-called barbarous races, then what was the nature of a tribe's sovereignty? We should think of sovereignty here as the authority and right to govern oneself as a people. By the early 18th century, sovereignty was a quality necessary for an independent state to be recognized. It also followed, in the course of the 18th century, that the leaders of tribes were more frequently referred to as chiefs. One might reasonably posit that when European powers sought alliances with native nations, they recognized the sovereignty of those nations and referred to their leaders as kings. Conversely, when a colonial power wished to downplay the sovereign independence of an indigenous polity, they referred to them as tribes and their leaders as chiefs. For indigenous peoples of the continental U.S., the history of their nation's sovereignty evolved with the shifting power dynamics of the expansion of the United States after its independence from Great Britain. Treaties made between colonial British authorities, representing the Crown, could obviously be abrogated by the new nation. But the U.S. continued to pursue a policy of treaty-making with indigenous nations well into the 19th century. A U.S. treaty carries the weight of a nation-to-nation agreement in which the sovereignty of both parties is recognized. Thus, the 1794 Canandaigua Treaty between the United States and the Six Nations, or Haudenosaunee Confederacy, represents a recognition of Haudenosaunee sovereignty. This treaty is still recognized by both parties and in effect to this day. However, the United States does not recognize the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as an independent state. The complexity of indigenous sovereignty within the continental United States goes back to a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1831. In the case of Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia, adjudicated by the Marshall Court, a precedent-setting decision was made on the nature of Native American sovereignty. Justice Marshall's opinion made clear that he believed that Native nations are neither foreign states in relation to the United States, nor independent of it. Rather, he infamously designated them domestic dependent nations. By retaining the term nations, he left open the possibility for a prescribed type of sovereignty at best, but he did not preclude indigenous sovereignty altogether. Instead, he placed it under the hegemony of the federal government, but outside of the state government's authority. As dependent nations, native governments retain a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government, but are not held to be independent states. Marshall portrayed the United States as having the duties of a guardian to its ward. But such paternalism would seem a de facto denial of a native nation's ability to exercise its sovereignty in any real way. Yet advocates of native sovereignty have argued that it must be practiced as a means of retaining the power to self-govern, just as Americans accept that cities govern themselves within self-governing states that in turn exist within the United States. They must accept that native sovereignty exists within, but separate from, other forms of sovereignty. The limitations of that sovereignty are constantly being tested by native nations, pushing back against state and federal policies that would interfere with their self-rule. The situation in the continental United States is the result of government policies and judicial rulings, such as Marshall's 1831 decision, but each settler colonial nation-state that resulted from European settler colonialism will reflect the unique colonial history of that place. For instance, in Australia, Britain did not make treaties with any of the Aboriginal nations, but rather pursued a policy of conquest and occupation, which ignored their existence as a people with inherent rights. By claiming the land fell under the category of terra nullius, nobody's land, Britain in effect held that there was no such thing as native title, and that as a civilized nation, the United Kingdom had the right to claim and colonize Australia. Whereas in Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, the settlers engaged in diplomacy with the Maori, as well as warfare, and together produced the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti, in 1840, a still deeply contested bilingual agreement, which remains a cornerstone of the respective notions of sovereignty between settlers and Maori citizens to this day. If we see Prospero as a stand-in for a proto-imperial colonial authority, it is in the paternalism which he uses to justify his rule over Caliban and over the island. He cannot see Caliban's bond with the land from anything but an instrumentalist perspective. He wants Caliban's knowledge to better exploit the environment, not to adapt and care for it. Indigenous sovereignty over oneself and one's homeland is very different from the sovereignty understood by Prospero and later colonists. There's no standard way that so-called indigenous sovereignty has been configured among settler colonial nations. Native nations continued to hold on to deep historical notions of self-governance and self-determination, even as they evolved to meet the global privileging of Westphalian international sovereignty definitions.